So we'll move on to talking about A, and the theme of A is attention. Paying attention to what's happening inside your body, paying attention to what's happening outside of your body, paying attention to thoughts and feelings is a good way of helping to move towards stress reduction. And so in the introduction, you're going to give the students a quick overview and what the key message is, and then move on to exploring some of the background information. So let's talk about that. So many of you have probably seen how important the literature on the teenage brain is, how much literature there is on the teenage brain, how much we're learning about the teenage brain. And one thing that we may not think about as clearly is that, is this a sensitive period? We may not have an understanding of what it means a sensitive period might be. So what is a sensitive period of development? Suggests that there's a period of time across the age span where there's maximum plasticity in the brain and the brain's functions for certain kinds of things. So if we think about it, very early on, there's plasticity for sight, for the development of kids, infants, toddlers, being able to see clearly. There's a reason why newborns' toys are black and white and big. It's because it helps them cue into those colors and those shades. They can't see the detail as well, but this helps them develop. By age 8 months, most kids are 20/20, so they can see that way. Motor development, same kind of thing. You can think about motor development as a window of opportunity. Usually between age 12 and 18 months, kids are walking. So they start a little bit earlier. They're developing the capacity to do that. Language development is the same thing. So by age 5, most kids have a pretty fluid language understanding, and it continues to develop, but they've developed the capacity for language. So one of the things that's needed is that there needs to be environmental stimulation during this time. So the brain is plastic, but there needs to be some kind of stimulation, some kind of input that facilitates that development for the kids. We call these periods sensitive periods mainly because the brain is developing in a certain way, and certain parts of the brain are developing at that period of time that allows these capacities to be seen. Another sensitive period could be the development of the social brain, and that might be happening during adolescence. So what is happening? So during adolescence, we know there's a greater capacity for social decision making, both positive and maybe not so positive. So on the not so positive side, kids may make decisions about risky behavior. They may start substance use, kids drive too fast, kids do dangerous things. So that earlier we talked about how the risk behaviors were the highest contributors to mortality and morbidity. And it's also a time where kids do more thinking about thinking, more mentalizing. So this can contribute to stress. And this is also, so we think about adolescence as another sensitive period. This has both positive and not so positive things. One positive thing about sensitive periods is it's more malleable. We can influence development perhaps more easily. So this is a nice quote by Larry Steinberg, who's a very famous adolescent researcher. And it suggests here that the malleability helps for the better, but can also help for the worse. And so what does all of this really mean? What does it mean that the brain is plastic through life? Is it always reorganizing? Are there always major changes? Well, one way that Steinberg has also talked about it is it's the difference between remodeling and redecorating. Certain times of our lives, we're remodeling. Other times of our lives, we're just kind of redecorating. We're just making little changes in our house. Other time, we're knocking it all down. We're knocking out walls and we're putting up new walls. And our brain is restructuring in some of the same ways. New functions are coming online. And so we have to think about how development changes and how the kinds of things that we can teach and do with adolescents may be more or less helpful. So we know that the brain is a central organ for stress management. And part of what influences this is our perception, how we perceive things, whether we perceive threats. Those threats can be actual threats outside of ourselves, or they can be perceived threats in our head, things that we remember, things that we imagine. And those perceived threats can be equally stressful for adolescents or for adults too. So, what are some common adolescent mental stressors? So here's a list of things that adolescents might think to themselves, might experience as threats to their psychological selves. These are not too different than the kinds of things that adults might experience. But in adolescence, there's a priming. There's they're really tuned in to these kinds of experiences, not getting what I want, not getting enough, not feeling secure socially. So the adolescent social brain is experiencing a lot of these things. And we see in adolescence that this may be part of why we see the onset of many disorders in adolescence. If adolescents are experiencing this stress, if their brain function isn't able to manage and regulate that stress well, we can see these kinds of disorders, impulse control disorders, anxiety and mood disorders. And we see the age of onset for many of these starting right in that adolescent age. So one of the implications here is that we may need some general kinds of interventions for adolescents. We may be able to teach them skills to manage these kinds of things. So stress doesn't only affect our emotions, our affect, but it also affects our ability to learn. It affects our attention, it affects our memory. So these cognitive capacities are also influenced by stress. So major parts of the brain that contribute to learning include the hippocampus, and this is really a part of processing information and memory. The amygdala, which enhances our memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which is reasoning, judgment, planning, and really what we think of as executive function. Oh, and we've got some of these here. Sorry, didn't think about that. So the learning and the memory are similar, the similar kinds of functions that are happening in learning and memory and in stress. So one of the things that we can do is help develop our attentional capacities, because we know what happens when we're overloaded with stress. We can't use those functions well. So Adele Diamond, who's one of the premier researchers in neuropsychology and cognitive neuropsychology in adolescents, kind of sums it up this way. And I won't read this to you, I'll let you read it for yourselves. And the point behind her understanding of executive functioning is we really have to understand the influence of stress on those functions as well. And so, what's happening in this period of adolescence is there's this fundamental imbalance. On the one hand, we have really strong emotions and impulses. So kids, adolescents are feeling these very powerful emotions, but they don't yet have the capacity to really modulate those, and they have these impulses. They're experiencing a lot of stress in their lives. This is the world of adolescence. But the brain is also still in progress. All of the capacities they need to manage these things on the left side over there aren't quite fully developed yet. So some people have called this a perfect storm. And that is one of the reasons we think things like learning to breathe are really beneficial in adolescence. So what do we do with our A section? So again, with the introduction and the recap, just like the other sections, we're going to start with a short mindfulness practice. We'll do a recap of B, R, E, and check-in. Rachel, do you have the cards?
Posters?
The posters, and just show the posters. So one of the ways that we can start the sessions is we'll have the posters and you can just put them up on the board, or if you need tape, we'll have tape for you. And it's just a nice way to remind them, I'm not going to do it here because they'll fall over, a nice way to remind them of what they've learned, recap, and move them forward.
Maybe briefly, I'll just pop in and show you a few of the other posters that we have, even though they're not broken here. So we, in week 2 through 6, put up the definition of mindfulness that we've agreed on, have put together reminders for at the end for what like the key takeaway messages are from each practice and what they should do for home practice. And we have these laminated, as you can tell. And then relevant to the section we're just doing, there are handouts which will be up there, but we display related to stress and performance and balance and things like that. And I found it really helpful to have these big versions of the posters that are laminated to make it easy.
Those are great, so you'll see those on the slides, but it's nice to have them in the room. And those are also in the workbooks, right?
They are. I will say some of the posters, like these we put together that are not in the workbook, and then have played around a little bit with the formatting of the things in the workbook so that they're really nice and crisp and big. So happy to share those with other labs and teams.
Right. And so so continuing on with A, the main points here in this session is really around wellness, depending on paying attention to what's happening inside and what's happening outside. And we talk about that as, I won't go back, the triangle of awareness. So we start by talking a little bit about stress and the unpleasant nature of stress, and helping kids to try and understand how stress affects us. We go through a case study, and I don't think I'll read the case study to you. There are a couple of different case studies. We'll do this tomorrow. And the case study helps them understand different types of stress, how our perception influences that stress, and then we also go through a discussion where we talk about different aspects of stress. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of questions that you can ask as a facilitator around their ideas of stress. Was that stress acute? Was it chronic? Did they experience the stress from the outside, or was that just from the inside? So these kinds of questions can facilitate the discussion. So you know, maybe you don't know, that you don't guide this by PowerPoint. We're guiding this training by PowerPoint, but you don't have PowerPoints in the session. It's discussion, it's posters, and it's experience. So you don't have to bore them with PowerPoints. So another activity that you can do is exploring stress and exploring the unpleasant nature of stress. And this is very similar to cross the line, or to the line up game, and we think about it as crossing the line. And one of the things that we can do here is that at the end of the E lesson, the students will list a number of stressors on an index card. You can use that card to identify stressors in this activity that the students have experienced. And again, they line up on the line, and you just ask how many of you have experienced this breakup of a significant other, and that you ask them to cross the line. So there's one hint about this activity that's really important, and that is you want to make sure that you select stressors that more than one person has named. So it might be a little bit awkward if only one person steps over that line. But if you have several of them stepping over that line, that reinforces the commonality of stress for them. And they get to understand that they're experiencing stressors that others are experiencing too. So another activity is called, another activity for exploring stress is called How Much Can You Handle? And the goal of this activity is to communicate that chronic stress causes a lot of problems. And we're going to do this one. So we're going to actually try this one. And what I would like is 3 volunteers.
I'm not volunteering, I'm just standing up one minute.
All right, I have 1 volunteer. She knows what she's in for.
True.
It's fun.
It is fun. This is a fun one.
I'll do it.
Yay!
All right, Reagan, thank you, Reagan. Oh, okay, thank you. Okay. So here's what we're going to do with this activity, okay? I'm just going to ask you to stand, you know what, how about you stand this way so we're not backs to everybody. Yep, that's good. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is do some things, do some activities, and I just want you to keep doing those as we continue on, okay? So I'm going to ask you to start this activity by just tapping your right foot. Okay, that's good. Keep going. Good. Okay. There you go. There you go. There you go. All right. Now, I want you to keep tapping your foot. Use your left hand and throw the ball up in the air and catch it with your left hand.
It already hurts.
Good. Good. Now I want you to start bending forward and backwards. As you tap your foot, and throw your... Good. All right. Now you all have a right arm, and swing your right arm around in a little circle while you bend forward.
Circle.
And tap your right foot. Keep tapping. That's right. Okay, excellent. Now, out loud,
Oh no.
begin to count backward from 100 by 2s.
Oh no.
As you swing your arm, tap your foot.
100,
98, 96,
Keep it all going. Keep
92,
it all going.
90, oh, you got that, 88, 86, 80. Oh my God.
All right, you guys are getting really good at this. Thank you very much. All right. You guys are great. So, how was that for you?
Impossible.
Impossible.
My foot was like cramping up, and then everything else is just, yeah, way too much to handle.
What did the others notice about that?
I noticed the anxiety and anticipation. There was like, oh no, at one point when you said now you're going to count as well.
So kind of a mounting anxiety? Okay. What else did you notice?
I feel like there was always one thing that I would forget to do, like bending over.
There's a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Life is a lot of things. Life has a lot of stressors. Stressors can mount. And they can pile up. So this kind of chronic stress can cause a lot of problems. We're also not the only ones that have that kind of stress in our lives. So how might this apply to stress in your lives?
You have so much on your plate, you can't do even one thing right.
When it